that, Labour won 40% of the vote, which is quite remarkable. And it turned out, I mean, the result decided that argument between those two competing views. It turned out that it was possible to win non-voters. 38% of the voters Labour gained in June 2017, which amounts to 2 million people, hadn't voted in 2015. And of those, 1.5 million were previous non-voters by choice, and the other 500,000 were newly eligible people, young people and so on. It was possible to win over young people. Labour won 60% of the vote amongst the under-30s. In 2015, Labour won 36% of the under-30 vote, which was really good. It was better than the Tories. It was considered a decent performance. The swing from 36% to 60% of the under-30s in 2 years is something astronomical. It was possible for a mass membership party to have an electoral impact. People had said the era of mass politics is over. The Labour Party has really kind of dumbfounded them. Because suddenly you've got all these people who are willing to go and knock on doors and have a tangible electoral impact by trying to persuade people face to face. And that's really where momentum came into its own at that point, because, as I said, the Labour Party was running this defensive strategy, sending not just money, but also volunteers to seats which were kind of safe, whereas Momentum had this strategy that any seat that had a majority of less than 7,000 was marginal, and they were going to encourage people to go there through their minorist marginal up and other things. And that proved really important, and there were lots of marginal seats where Momentum effectively ran the campaign, and they became Labour seats. Labour took those seats. But most of all, I think it proved that the election result proved that it is possible to gain votes standing on the left platform. People will remember the Manifesto League, which was done by somebody in Kezia Dugdale's office. It was a malicious act to try and water down the Labour Party manifesto before the Clause 5 meeting was going to finalise it. But it turned out to be a complete, backfired, and the press reacted exactly as you'd expect. All the headlines about back to the 1970s, nationalisation, all this kind of stuff. And then a poll was done a couple of days later, Comrade's poll in the Mirror, which showed that all these things which had been political taboos since the 80s had kind of 60 to 70% support amongst the public for things like taxing the rich a little bit more, nationalising water, nationalising rail, all of these things had massive public support. Even things like 20-to-1 ratio between the highest paid and lowest paid people in a company, which is one of the more radical policies, had massive public support, along with not reintroducing fox hunting. And so that experience really kind of broke the spell of 1983, because Labour gained, in 2017, Labour gained 5 million votes. Overall, Labour's vote went up 3.6 million, but some didn't vote Labour who had voted Labour previously. So if you take all the people who hadn't voted Labour who did vote Labour, that's 5 million extra people who were attracted by this platform. And in 1983, Michael Foot had a left manifesto and been crushed, and it had just become accepted wisdom in Britain that that's what happens. If you go to the electorate with a left platform, you're going to get annihilated. And that accepted wisdom was really wiped out by the 2017 general election. And that boxed out some space for progressive left politics in Britain, which just didn't exist before. And I don't think it really matters if you're on the right of the Labour Party, left of the Labour Party, not in the Labour Party at all. It's surely a good thing that you can now talk about progressive politics and progressive ideas like, for example, the most wealthy people should pay a little bit more tax, and be taken seriously and be able to express those ideas. Because really, until that happened, until 2015, that space had just been so closed down, it wasn't there anymore. There were no more public services that were left to be privatised almost. It kind of reached the end of the line, and now that we've got that space, we can try to use it. So the fact that the Corbyn phenomenon didn't come from nowhere, that we can explain its lineage, should give us hope. When the economic orthodoxy can no longer deliver, it means that political turbulence follows, and that brings an opportunity. It doesn't mean that the left will necessarily win, but at least there's a chance. We do know, though, that it wasn't enough to elect Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader, and it won't be enough to elect him as Prime Minister either. It will require even bigger mobilisations. The onslaught will be even more ferocious, as we've seen recently. That's just a foretaste of what will happen when Labour's in government, trying to implement its radical plans. I think that the key to whether Corbynism will ultimately succeed or fail lies in an aspect of the phenomenon, the movement, which is not really talked about that often, which is its kind of participative spirit and ethos. And that was particularly obvious back in 2015, when Corbyn first ran for leader. They produced a whole bunch of policy papers which most of them ended up in the 2017 manifesto. It's quite remarkable the extent of the similarity between the two campaigns. But in one of the notable features in 2015 was in all of these policy papers, they said, we want to hear your ideas. And for some of them, they actually emailed Labour members in a particular area and asked for submissions before they did it. And there was a real kind of ethos of, we want to do this together, we want to be open to new politics, we want people to participate, to get active. And you can trace that through, and it's still being done. It gets completely obliterated by all of the onslaught and the kind of stuff that's thrown at the Labour Party by the press and what we end up talking about all the time. But, for example, John McDonnell at the moment is doing more of this kind of work of trying to imagine how nationalised industries can be run, not in the old-fashioned way, not in the 1945 way of kind of top-down Westminster control kind of bureaucracies, but trying to open them up to worker control, workers having a role in the running of the industries that they work in, and public involvement as well. And that stuff's going on. There's kind of things, I think, there's something called a Community Wealth Commission. All of these initiatives are going on below the surface, but we never hear about them because they just get drowned out by all the other stuff. So that's the stuff which I think really we need to get involved in as Labour Party members or people on the left. And the question for everyone, I think, is, given the pressures on the Labour leadership are so great, what do we need to do to make it work, rather than what can Jeremy Corbyn do? He's in battle. He's standing there taking all the flak. I think the question is, what can we do to get involved in this and help to make it work? And we already know instinctively that within the Labour Party itself, it needs to be democratised. We need to have more democratic participation as a way of kind of exerting counter-pressure to the pressures that are going to be on the leadership. We also know that the Labour Party needs to reach out to its surroundings, and we're seeing that now, which was blocked for a long time under the previous Labour Party kind of machine, but now it's happening that Labour Party is doing community organising. It has an executive director of community organising. It has community organisers all being appointed around the country to try and persuade CLPs and other party groups to get involved in local campaign struggles, which a lot of people do already, a lot of groups do already, but in lots of places they don't, or CLPs don't at least, to try to make the Labour Party something that's part of the community, so that when the election comes around, first of all, it has an electoral benefit, because people think that the Labour Party is an ally, but second of all, you don't have to wait until you take Westminster power before you actually start to change the circumstances of people's lives and show them that things can change. And then the third thing is the idea of kind of bottom-up policy making and people being able to contribute, which really hasn't happened yet, but hopefully the Labour Party's, with the democracy review that's happening at the moment, hopefully the Labour Party's policy making process will be opened up so that members can actually take a genuine role in it. And I'll just kind of wind up with a quote from Jeremy Corbyn that I think kind of shows that this has been how he's seen the project all the way through, at least. In 2015, he was reflecting on the reasons for his success, and he said, "It's not just here. There are equivalent movements across Europe, the USA, and elsewhere. It's been bubbling for a long time. It's opposition to an economic orthodoxy that leads us into austerity and cuts, but it's also a thirst for something more communal and more participative." And I think it's that participative potential, which is the great promise of Corbynism, that so far we've only partly fulfilled, but that should give us hope that there's more to come. So that's the opportunity that's before us. When history offers up an opportunity like that, you don't really get to and R about it, you just have to seize it. There's lots more about all this stuff in my book, which I've got some copies there. They were selling out even before we started, which is unusual, so I like Norwich. But you can buy, it's not compulsory, but you can buy one if you want, £10. There's a whole chapter in there about the media attacking the media, which I realised after I wrote it probably wasn't a good idea for getting reviews. So if you do want to buy one, please buy one, and if you like it, when you've read it, please tell your friends, because I'm relying on word of mouth dissemination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. I'm sure that was as good as we hoped. We'll take some questions, we'll have a debate, we'll have comments. I'll try and keep order. Forgive me if I don't see too many hands, but who's going to start? Jack?
Thank you. In the 2015 elections, much thought was given to the selection of candidates. I'll give one example, Canterbury, which went Labour for the first time. I just recently read an interview with the successful Labour MP, and she credited Tony Blair with winning She is not a Corbynite, Corbynist, if you like. I think part of the change, if it's going to come, is in open selection. I'm just wondering, it must be discussed this year at the NEC, but something that has to happen to get a really left agenda moving. Do you have any views on that?
We're going to do one at a time.
Well, I've got no hands up at the moment. People are shy. David.
Yeah, not a question actually, it's an observation, Alex. In the book you point out that Margaret Beckett was one of Corbyn's nominators, which is really strange. I wonder whether you'd like to comment on it.
I was wondering what you think about the fact that where the Labour Party should go in terms of the Brexit situation.
It's a dodgy system with lots of abuse. So one option is that that's just going to be sorted out so that the trigger ballot system can work, even though it's not ideal. The second option is mandatory reselection, which has been proposed by Labour International, CLP, where every Labour MP has to take part in a contest to be reselected before a general election. And then the third option is a kind of, I think it's Momentum who come up with it, where there's a vote and an MP has to gain 2/3 of the members of the local party and the local affiliates in order not to have a contest. So if the thinking behind that is if an MP can get 2/3 of the vote, then they're not going to lose a contest anyway, so there's no point in going through the hassle of having a contest. But if they don't get 2/3, then you can have an open contest. So there's all these things which are going to be decided at conference. It'll probably happen, the NEC might take a view on the 18th of September and propose something. Depends how the maths works out on the NEC and what else is being offered in exchange for that. If not, then the motions might be composited. We don't know how it's going to look, but there may well be a motion at conference for some kind of reform to the selection procedures. It's not a panacea though, because the PLP, the left has made amazing strides throughout the party in the last kind of 3 years. Kind of some of it under the radar, some of it more obvious. The two areas where it's not made any progress really is local government and the PLP. And even if all 75 of the candidates in marginal seats, for example, who have been selected were from the left, which they're not, about 50-50 left-right, but even if all of them have been from the left, and then even if all of them have won their seats in the general election, you'd still have a PLP that was dominated by the right. So, we know from the history of mandatory reselection that normally MPs get reselected anyway, when it was in operation in the 80s, because they have local power bases and so on. So it's not likely that the PLP is not something which is going to be reformed in a hurry, basically, is what I'm saying. I think that my personal view is there does need to be a rule change to allow constituency parties to be able to choose their candidates, because there's no other part of the Labour Party that has these privileged councillors who are subject to reselection. And it just seems obvious that if you're standing as election, as we've seen with Frank Bill and so on, if you're going to stand for election as a Labour candidate, you should at least have something in common with your constituency party. It's kind of fairly low bar. But even if it's, my point is, even if that's accepted, you're still talking about a kind of 10-year process before you actually really reshape the parliamentary Labour Party. So it's not something that's going to be solved quickly. Why did Margaret Beckett nominate Jeremy Corbyn? She said it was the biggest mistake of her life, and then she was an idiot or a fool or something like that. Moron, was it moron? She did it probably. I mean, she used to be on the left back in the 70s, and she's known Jeremy Corbyn for a long time, and she didn't expect him to win. And I think her rationale was she was just trying to open up debate. Because, the early weeks of that leadership contest in 2015 were really atrocious when you had the three, you had Andy Burnham, Liz Kendall and Yvette Cooper, and then you had other people like Tristram Hunt, there were lots of people in the background like Stella Creasy and Caroline Flynn, and they were all basically in the same political space, and they were all competing for nominations from MPs, which pushed them all to the right. And it was awful. They were talking about the word aspiration became the buzzword of that early part of the contest, and they all had a slightly, like Andy Burnham had a different meaning of aspiration. He said aspiration means the aspirations of everybody, whereas Tristram Hunt said that Labour needs to appeal to people who aspire to shop in Waitrose, which which is quite brave for Patricia Munt, because in Stoke-on-Trent, where he's the MP, there isn't a waitress. So, he could have been out of a job. But they're all having this debate about aspiration, and the general public obviously didn't know what the hell they were going on about, because most people don't know what they're talking about to start with, and nobody understands these subtle nuances of difference between what they all mean when they say aspiration. So it was just completely horrific. So I think probably Margaret Beckett just wanted, I assume she just wanted Jeremy Corbyn to be in the race just to try and freshen it up a bit and at least have some kind of substantive debate. But yeah, she said she was a moron. On the third question about Brexit, obviously, I mean, Labour said from the very beginning that it would guarantee the status of European nationals living in the UK. So if there was a Labour government, whatever Labour does with Brexit, you would have security in this country that you weren't going to be kicked out and that your rights weren't going to be affected. So you certainly should feel able to talk about it, and it's sad to hear that you can't. And I completely agree with your point that the human side of Brexit is never really talked about compared to the kind of economic stuff and all of that. Obviously, if to get a Labour government, Labour's the only party that can get into government that will guarantee the rights of European citizens. But to get into government, Labour does have to win an election. So you inevitably come up against the electoral calculations. And even this might sound, I don't mean to sound kind of hard-hearted or hard-faced or whatever, but just the electoral maths is a big part of the reason for Labour's position. Because if you, for example, in the 2017 general election, Labour's results, Labour gained 10 points among people who voted Remain, which is big, on 2015. So its vote went up 10 points among people who voted Remain. And that was the biggest expansion of its support. But it also gained 5 points among people who voted Leave. If it hadn't gained those 5 points, then the Tories would have a big majority and you'd be getting in the hardest version of Theresa May's Brexit. So there is a need to get to accept the reality of the fact that although 2/3 of Labour voters voted to Remain, 1/3 of Labour voters voted to Leave, their opinions may be changing. We're seeing some opinion polls which suggest they're changing.
Exactly.
But that's just a fact of life in politics, which means that Labour can't just ignore them.
Well, I just want to say, Alex, I really enjoyed your book because for all these sort of very complex issues that come up around anti-Semitism and these really sort of challenging issues that we've got to try and sort of traverse. One of the things that I found really useful about your book was that it was really grounding. It showed to me that it wasn't as fragile as I thought it was, and sometimes we get this impression that it's really fragile and it's about to sort of disappear. But there's a real movement and a real sort of shift that's led us to this particular point. And I get a real sense that actually change is inevitable. And we're actually going to push through this and we will actually get a Labour government led by a socialist, which I think is really exciting and inspiring. And I take a lot of heart from reading your book. And I'd like to think about, you know, what happens next? What do we need to do? You sort of alluded to what we do as members. And certainly I feel that, you know, I'm one of these people that bang my head very hard against the Labour bureaucracy and sort of struggle as a result. But reading your book really sort of gives me a sense that actually things are going to open up very quickly. And what do we need to be thinking about? What opportunities are there that we don't always look at because we're too busy looking down, fighting these sort of crises coming up and what have you. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that and your analysis of what would happen when Corbyn actually gets in and what we need to be doing to make the most of it and to really get there, if that makes sense.
Well, just on the last one, because that's basically what my book's about. That's the question. No, that's fine. You don't have to. It's not a problem. But that's the question that I'm interested in. Why does it happen at a particular time when it didn't happen before? You know, it didn't even happen in 2010, for example. Diane Abbott ran for leadership and got absolutely nowhere. And it does come down to these. You need to have the circumstances in place, like you say. It was a product of years of austerity, and it was a product of the fact that the economy was on its knees and that people couldn't get affordable housing and that wages had stagnated and all these things. These things provide the kind of fuel, but it could easily have been blocked. And when I told that story about them getting on the ballot and the 2 nominations they needed and all that stuff, it was a matter of seconds, and that would have been a bureaucratic blockage, and we'd have had Andy Burnham as Labour leader, and nothing much would have changed politically. Well, it depends what happened in the Brexit referendum, I suppose, but it could easily have not happened. It was really, really close. And so that's what I find really fascinating about history, is that interplay between agency and chance and the circumstances. And so I think that it's, boring answer, but it's kind of both things. That you needed to have that context for it to happen, and you needed to have those particular advantages. But I do think it's particularly tied. I do think the Corbyn phenomenon is particularly tied to the economic crash of 2008. Actually, it's not just a Corbyn phenomenon. I think you can look out across Europe and see all of the strange phenomena that are happening, and in the United States. It's not happening the same on the left and the right. Sometimes people equate Corbyn and Trump and all that kind of stuff. I don't think they're the same drivers necessarily, but they're certainly different products of the same crisis. And so you have, Trump, and you have the rise of the far right in Europe, but you also have Syriza in Greece, which didn't work out very well. But all of these things have been happening for a long time, and it can't just be chance. It's not just that these things randomly happen. They happen because they're a product of the underlying economic situation, which is the consequence of the 2008 crash. And the failure, and what the 2008 crash was the failure of an economic ideology in Thatcherism or neoliberalism or whatever you want to call it, which had told us that it was the answer to everything and that there was no more boom and bust, to quote Gordon Brown. And all of these, it was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama, the philosopher, said. All of this stuff had been sorted out now. And we had liberal capitalist democracy, and nothing was going to challenge that. Soviet Union had ended, everything was fine. And 2008 happened. It's like, well, none of that's actually true. We're still living with the same unstable economic system that we've had for 250 years, and it's still prone to crises, and we're still going to have these periods of turbulence. And it's not working for the majority of people in the world, and even in the country, even in a rich country like this. And so, I think that it's definitely a product of that economic context and that circumstance. But there's a lot more about that in the book. It's got 400 pages.
Which you talked about.
On Mark's question about, thank you for saying that you like the book, and what will happen when Jeremy Corbyn gets into power? Well, I think it will be like everything we've experienced, but much worse. You wonder, but they'll find one. I think it will just be an onslaught of, every little thing will be blamed on the government. The media is going to still be, massively opposed. It's just going to be a firestorm of different things. You probably will have, the idea is that there is a possibility of investment strikes and all that kind of stuff going on. It depends really on the Brexit situation, actually, because we're in a strange situation at the moment where the CBI is more inclined to Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party than Theresa May's leadership of the Conservative Party. So that kind of throws things a little bit up in the air. In terms of what we can be doing, I mean, I alluded to it in terms of taking a more kind of active role in policy making and all that kind of stuff, because it's really going to need a mobilised constituency backing Corbyn from below if he's going to be able to resist the pressures. Because, for example, with party democracy, the traditional view of the left, of the left, if you like, on party democracy is democratise the party so that party members have a say over policy and have a say over all this stuff. Because when James Callaghan gets into government, he's going to want to compromise. I still think that applies with Jeremy Corbyn. We know what Jeremy Corbyn stands for. We know he's never going to stand for anything else. But he can't defy gravity. The pressures on him will still be as intense as you'd expect. And so there will be all of these pressures from one side: compromise, compromise, compromise. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't nationalise this, you can't do that. And if he's going to succeed at all, he needs a countervailing pressure from the other side or from below, saying that we demand this. And so that's the kind of the point of party democracy, is that you then hold the Prime Minister Corbyn, to the manifesto that the party's decided by having power invested in the membership. But then there's another dynamic with Corbyn as leader, because then which we saw actually in 2015 after he became leader. If you remember, there was a vote to bomb Syria, and it looked like all the press reporting, well, the majority of Labour MPs are going to vote to bomb Syria. And then Corbyn emailed the Labour membership and said, email me, tell me your views on this. And just over a weekend, and they had like an influx of thousands and thousands of emails, 70% of which said don't do it. And that, according to just mainstream press sources, did change the calculation in the Parliamentary Labour Party to the extent where the rebellion ended up quite small. I think 50 or 60, all right, it's like a reasonable number, but it was much less than was predicted originally. And so that's the other dynamic of party democracy, that Corbyn will need the membership to aid him, given that we discussed the PLP. This is not something which is going to change, dramatically anytime soon. Corbyn is going to need the membership to be an ally, really, in that battle, that parliamentary battle with members of the Labour Party. And then outside that's kind of a little bit introspective maybe in the Labour Party, but it will have an important impact. But then one of the things that's probably most worrying about the last 3 years is that because so much energy on the left has been sucked into the Labour Party and the Corbyn project, the kind of wider mobilisations outside the party have been markedly less vociferous and less pronounced. And that is going to be needed as well, because you need a broad social base. This is why the community organising stuff is so important. You need a kind of broad, mobilised population beyond the party membership. Membership is massive, 500,000, but even beyond that, you need to reach millions of more people who are actually invested in it working. And if it comes to it, if there is a moment of crunch, the government needs to be able to turn around to the population and say, look, we want to do this, this reform. These forces in society are preventing us. Do you back us? And at that point, you need the population to be engaged and aware enough to be able to say, yeah, we back you to do that on this particular issue. No doubt that there will be mass popular support, but it needs to be organised popular support. So that's really that's what all this stuff means about getting engaged, community organising, party democracy, all that stuff. It's not just for the sake of it, it's so that when it matters, it can be deployed as a power. So that's that. And then the other question was about Brexit, and why aren't we opposing it as much as we could be? And that echoes the comment from the front about being more vociferous in their opposition. I mean, I think my personal view is that if Labour came out as a hard Remain party and said, no, we're not accepting Brexit, you would definitely lose the next election, you would definitely have Brexit. One of the standout examples of where they were trying to send volunteers to the wrong place, because they were saying, Alison McGovern was she Rural West? No, Rural South. She did, according to that list that I mentioned, where it named MPs in terms of safe seats, she was projected to lose her seat because there was a reasonably big UKIP vote, and her majority wasn't huge. So they thought that she was going to lose. But they sent absolutely everybody, didn't they? The regional director sent everybody from all around the area to there, and not to Margaret Greenwood's seat and the other seats, and Weaver Vale and all the others. Labour won all of them in the end. But that regional director, I think, has just been replaced, the North West regional director, because this is another area where the Labour Party is just this bizarre organisation that's so complicated and no one knows how it works. But regional directors have huge power, and the regional bureaucracies have huge power to do this kind of thing, to direct volunteers and to direct resources. And they're unaccountable to members because they're appointed by the General Secretary. And so when Nicol was the General Secretary of the Labour Party, nothing could be done. These were beyond the reach of the leadership. Nothing could be done about this stuff. Obviously, when Nicol was replaced with Jenny Formby, I think what we're seeing now is that lots of these regional directors are being replaced or leaving. And so this kind of scenario hopefully won't happen in the same way again. It happened everywhere. It happened in London. I don't live in London, I live in Essex, but I went into London to campaign, and I was concentrating on Battersea, which Labour won, but was not expected to win. But I was with people from Putney, and everybody was being sent to Tooting, which was a fairly safe seat, City Council seat, which the London regional bureaucracy was sure that Labour was going to lose. And so it was sending, even on election day, everybody was being told to go to Tooting. And the people in Putney, the left in Putney, said, no, we're not going to go there, we're going to go to Battersea to try and get Marshal de Cordova elected. In actual fact, people in Putney should have stayed in Putney because they came within a few thousand votes of getting rid of Justine Greening. But anyway, that was just because it exceeded expectations. So yes, I agree with you. I agree that was Momentum's best, that was Momentum's finest hour, was organising and providing the infrastructure to enable campaigners to go to where they were actually needed rather than where they were told to go. And it's just remarkable that the Labour Party, this just shows the extent of the problem and the extent of the, how far the left has come, if you like, under Corbyn's leadership. It's just remarkable that the Labour Party had this influx of hundreds of thousands of people who joined it, who were a volunteer army of Labour who would go and do things for free. And there were some isolated examples, but there was no centrally directed attempt to train these people, to knock on doors, and to make them an electoral asset. They were just ignored because they didn't want them to become an independent power. And it's just amazing that that was left to momentum. An organisation doesn't really have a budget, just a few tens of thousands of pounds, to do these like training sessions and to do these big campaigning days and to provide the minor marginal tools show where people could go. The Labour Party didn't even do that. When the Labour Party is this big organisation, got £50 million turnover or something, and just had this massive resource, the most valuable resource you can get, people who are willing to give up their time, and just completely ignored them. So, but that stuff's changing. That's one of the things that should give us hope for the next general election. Was that Labour got 40% of the vote, even despite it not doing all this stuff, which was obvious and which it should have done. And so that potential still remains to be exploited. And I won't go on for ages about the other ones, but I mentioned earlier that local government is one of the areas where not much has changed from the pre-Corbyn Labour Party to the current Labour Party, and along with the PLP. And this is going to be probably one of the main areas of contestation over the next kind of 3 years, I think, of Labour Party members trying to make their views felt in local government, so that we don't end up with the situation of Labour activists ending up campaigning against Labour councils. But it's like with the PLP, it's a problem that's going to take a long time to solve. And I agree about the point about the blaming the other for the 2008 crash, blaming immigrants. Of course, that's one of the great things about Jeremy Corbyn compared to the kind of UKIP response to the crash, is that Jeremy Corbyn has always been strong on that you don't blame immigrants for economic problems which are not caused by immigrants. I think that actually it's a shame that Labour hasn't been stronger. That's one area where I'd like them to be stronger than they have been over the last 3 years on immigrant rights, and not just European citizens, but immigrant rights in general, because there is obviously a kind of toning down of Corbyn's pre-2015 rhetoric on that stuff, which I think is a shame. I'm not as confident as you about the likelihood of the PLP passing all of the domestic policies. I agree that there's a sharp difference between, on domestic policy, most of the PLP, well, at least it doesn't make a fuss about it. It's kind of, Corbyn's anti-austerity domestic agenda is completely supreme and nobody bothers to try and challenge him on it. It doesn't mean they believe in it, but they don't challenge him on it. On foreign affairs, that's where the really sharp division comes, and that's actually a historical thing. That's because of the strands in the Labour Party that date back to the Cold War and so on, and the divisions between the left and the right. But if you imagine the Labour Party gets elected on a manifesto that's going to scrap student fees, Chris Leslie's not going to vote for that. If they don't have a big majority, and it only takes 10 Labour MPs to not vote for something for it not to go through, you can imagine people like Chris Leslie, Angela Smith, all those lot, not voting for lots of it. They won't vote. Angela Smith's not going to vote to nationalise the water industry. But really, when I said about the crunch, I think there could come a kind of economic situation where it's kind of, you have to do this, you have to implement these cuts. The Bank of England says, and all these institutions say, and it becomes clear that there's a kind of almost blackmail of the government. You have to do this if you're not going to avert this economic catastrophe or whatever. That's the situation I was talking about with the crunch. On foreign affairs, I agree. I think one of the reasons actually why the anti-Semitism stuff is so effective is because most people don't have a clue about Israel and Palestine and don't understand the nuances of it. And so when they hear Jeremy Corbyn talking about Zionism, most people don't know what Zionism means. Most of the Trump doesn't know what Zionism means. And so they can't work out, and probably don't care, which side is right and which side is wrong, and what they're all saying. Also why opinion polls show that not many people are paying attention to that particular thing. And yeah, I'm sure that the crunch, I'm sure that when there are foreign affairs decisions, it will be difficult, but I think on those ones, they tend to be, when you're in government, the Prime Minister tends to sort of almost become the Foreign Secretary, if you like. Foreign policy decisions tend to be reserved to the Prime Minister ultimately, especially big ones. And so that will go to Corbyn, so it will be less a matter of parliamentary wrangling, because it's not about legislation, so they can't really vote against a lot of that stuff. I think the pressure will come from inside Number 10 and from the Foreign Office and from the establishment, because obviously Jeremy Corbyn's positions on foreign affairs are against what the British state, often in many cases, against what the British state considers to be its interests. And I will put up a fight. So I would say that in terms of parliamentary crunches, I would say they will come on domestic policies, perhaps more than foreign policy. But foreign policy is the area of sharpest division. What impact would the second referendum have on democracy would it delegitimise the idea of democracy? I mean, I think that is the biggest principled argument against the second referendum is that Parliament voted to ask the general population to take a decision, and the general population then took a decision. And so if you then say, well, no, we're not going to take any notice of your decision, then that does have consequences. I mean, you might think it's worth having consequences, but it does have consequences in terms of people's feeling of trust in the democratic system, and also it's very likely that it would unleash a really kind of quite nasty form of right-wing fascism as well. That you get people say, you know, you can already kind of see it. You get people saying I was betrayed, and that energy and that anger would manifest itself politically in a way that's quite appalling. Doesn't necessarily mean you should retreat in front of that, because obviously you can't say, well, just because people are going to be angry, I'm going to do it. But that would be a consequence. And so I do think that there's a kind of, you have to have a high consideration if you're going to go for the kind of second referendum angle. That doesn't mean that if the opinion polls don't show that there's massive, overwhelming support for it, that there's not, you couldn't make the opposite argument in the sense of, well, there's democratic consent for this. So I think it's just one of those, you have to, it depends on the timing of when it happens really as to what the consequences would be. But I agree that that's a genuine worry. And what was the other one? Syria, Kurdish movement. Why is there less protesting on that? I mean, I think it's a bit of a non-argument of why people are protesting about Israel-Palestine and not other conflicts around the world, because you have to people haven't got infinite energy. The Israel-Palestine conflict is the longest existing military occupation on earth, so it's unusual. People of Palestine have been occupied since 1967, it's 1948 when the Nakba happened. So it's a very long-standing foreign policy concern. So I don't think that people should be castigated for paying attention to trying to get justice there and not everywhere else in the world. So I don't buy that particular argument.
No, you have to be for everywhere else in the world.
But
When you're talking about
well, just because they're close geographically doesn't necessarily mean that they have any other affinity to each other. But in terms of Syria and the Kurdish movement, I mean, one of the accusations that was put against Corbyn is, oh, well, you're soft on Syria because you're an Assad apologist or whatever. But you're right to bring up the Kurdish movement, because the Kurdish movement, when the recent Turkish invasion happened in Afrin, it was completely ignored by the Labour Party as well. I don't think Emily Thornberry said much. And it was a completely outrageous breach of international law and a war crime, essentially. And there's no greater supporter of the Kurds historically than Jeremy Corbyn. So this can't be down to personal politics. Because Jeremy Corbyn, obviously, he was one of the only MPs who protested against the gassing of the Kurds by Saddam al-Abdul in 1988. He led a protest march to the Iraqi embassy demanding Britain stop the arms trade with Iraq when Britain was an ally of Iraq. People who later were so offended by the gassing of the Kurds in al-Abdul, like Tony Blair, funny enough, they were MPs, they didn't say anything at the time. So I don't think you can't. Often this discussion gets personalised to Jeremy Corbyn, but I don't think it is.
okay, I don't want to personalise it.
Okay,
but when it comes to Assad using gas, very specific now, not historical things, and Jeremy Corbyn's absolutely right, and has a great past on things like that. But they tend to sort of go, well, we'll wait for the UN to say something, or the Organisation of Chemical Weapons. When they, and Saudi Arabia, we should definitely talk about. But when the information, like in, I forgot the name of the era, but it was last year, discussed that. When the information comes in, naked, doesn't come out and say, oh, no, Assad did actually use that. They say, let's wait for the facts, and then when the facts are in, don't step up.
yeah, I don't think there's any problem with waiting for the Organisation for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to try and determine facts. I think it's
No, when they do then determine the facts, there's no follow-up for that.
I can see where you're coming from. I think that it's a difficult. I mean, it's a civil war. You describe it as a revolution, and I agree it started as a revolution in 2011. But it has become a civil war, and it has become a proxy war for various powers: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US, Britain, France. Everybody's piling in, and so it's a huge, complicated mess, and it's less easy to take a distinctive and clear position which doesn't involve bringing in those parties to try and negotiate a peace, which is obviously the only way that the war is ever going to end. So I think that the situation is extremely complicated, and that it's kind of appropriate that it's matched by a nuanced response, if you like, rather than a kind of knee-jerk response.
The public at large, with up to reacting to foreign policy issues. Well, I think back the Manchester, the terrorist attack there, and after that, Jeremy Corbyn, Nunns suggested we should look to our own foreign policy and the reasons why this atrocity had taken place. Well, it was immediately hounded down by the press and the Labour Party right wing. And lo and behold, they had a survey which showed that most people actually agreed with him. The dumb public were far more sceptical and abrasive about foreign policy than anybody had thought. Well, I think that the Labour Party should think through that policy, because I don't think that the public, I think the public is sceptical about the army, they're sceptical about the role of the military, they're sceptical about why Britain is a permanent member of the Security Council, they're sceptical about why we're in NATO, and the Labour Party should do the sort of things that Corbyn did after the Manchester event. I mean, I think he tried to do that at the Edinburgh media thing. He tried to sort of say, the people who are running this media show are all public school bullies. The 7% are running the show. But he didn't say that. What he should have said, if I'd have been Seamus Milne, I would have said, these are the guys at ITN, and these are the public schools they went to. These are the guys at sort of Channel 4, and these are the public schools they went to. But he didn't really have the guts. It's only one of the tiny things the Labour Party have got to do in order to re-galvanise. We've got to take a tip from George Galloway. Despite all his faults, he was a far more, and I'll just say one final thing. There's a recent book called Posh Boys, which I recommend you all to read. Because although the politics are a bit wobbly, it's very good on naming names and telling you. I mean, I realised before I read it, we live in a class-ridden society. After reading it, I know that for sure.
More generally, what your thoughts are on like the kind of think tank system, and whether or not the left would be relying on think tanks and trying to model that style of policy generation, or if you think there's better ways to democratise that process.
Yeah, just two quick questions. I'm just thinking about potential issues in the future. The boundary review, which is coming out, I believe, next month, which is, as far as I understand, is not going to be beneficial to Labour. And where is the Corbyn project of the next election if we are the biggest party, but we don't have a majority? How does Corbyn work with the SNP?
What happened last time when the result came in and it was on Parliament was Labour immediately said that they wouldn't be in a formal coalition with anybody, but they would govern as a minority party and seek support. And then obviously if they're putting through popular policies, then the onus is then on the SNP to say why they don't support nationalising the water industry or whatever it is, if they're not going to vote for it. So I guess you do it piece by piece. I think that's the Labour position. There's an interesting question on the IPPR report and this kind of think tank ecosystem. I mean, one of the problems for the Labour Party, for the Corbyn leadership, is that it hasn't had that infrastructure of think tanks and so on that provide policy ideas, and so everything's been done in-house. And I think it has benefits and disadvantages to do it like that, because you don't get kind of drawn into that kind of weird world of the think tanks and their policy wonks and all that kind of stuff, and you can come out with more radical stuff that way. But on the other hand, it just would be helpful to have other people arguing in the media. Like, it's actually helpful today to have the IPPR and the Archbishop of Canterbury arguing for taxing wealth, because that makes it easier for John McDonnell to say that. Maybe he's going to announce that at a conference or whatever, I don't know. But if they want to do that, it kind of paves the way. So it's important. And the only apart from IPPR, the only one that's even talks to the Labour leadership is CLASS, which is basically a Unite-funded think tank. The IPPR is trying to, it's Blairite think tank originally, but it's trying to launch itself as at least open to ideas from the left, and it's got people like Grace Blakely and so on who are good. And so, yeah, I think it's beneficial, but I think, obviously, it's not as good as having a democratic policy-making process, because that's when you get ideas of people who are affected by the policies themselves. And for example, when people who work in industries knowing how the industries can go around, all that kind of thing. So I think a combination. I think it doesn't hurt to have the IPPR doing stuff that's good when they do stuff that's good. But definitely, one of the things which I hope comes out of the democracy review is a much more democratic policy-making process within the Labour Party, where the National Policy Forum is not so bizarre and opaque and removed from everybody, that we can actually have think tank-like discussions with normal people who haven't, necessarily done a PPE course at Oxford. That would be good. And then on the foreign policy and the Manchester attack speech, you're right, the Manchester attack speech was a really important moment in the general election when everybody thought Jeremy Corbyn would have to walk on eggshells because there'd been this terrorist atrocity and he was being branded a terrorist sympathiser by the Sun and everybody else on the right. And he instead came out and 4 days after the attack gave a speech which was actually much more cautious and reasoned than it was expected. The journalists all hoped that he was going to make the slip up they were waiting for. And it's kind of like the manifesto leak in the sense that they reacted to the speech exactly as you'd expect, saying Jeremy Corbyn is justifying terrorism, saying it's Britain's fault, and explicitly said that there was no justification for the act. And that's how the press reported it. And then an opinion poll came out on the same day by YouGov showing majority support for Corbyn's position, because the general public is very sceptical about foreign interventions. I'm not sure about your list of other things that the general public is not sceptical about, because I think on some of those, the opinion polls show there isn't necessarily support for a kind of left position. But certainly when it comes to British military intervention abroad, there is a lot of sympathy, more sympathy than the media would care to admit for a left position. But more importantly, probably than that, is just the idea that if you talk to the public seriously and treat them as grown-ups, they're not necessarily going to just take the line that they're expected to take. They will listen to your arguments and give you a fair hearing, and I think that's what that Manchester speech showed, even at the most extreme, in the most extreme circumstances, and that's kind of really hopeful, I think, and really pleasing to see that happened.
Just to say, I love books 1 and 2, read them in one sitting, can't wait for book number 3. I'm wondering if one chapter might be on the recent events of the summer with the IHRA, etc. One thing that struck me is that I'm wondering what the future is for Momentum at the moment, because with John Lansman voting to adopt the full IHRA code with no caveats, it seemed like he was turning his back on Jeremy Corbyn a little bit, and I know sort of Momentum membership has been quite split over this, and some of us feel a bit betrayed by him, to be honest. So
Damn right.
I'm wondering what direction
Lastly, Lisa.
I'd like to ask what you think about the rollout of universal credit. Because I think that's going to be a catalyst, that's going to be something that we in the left can mobilise behind.
Sarah talks about Momentum and...
There is one that I'd like to answer, though, is about, why are things that we pass as motions not getting through?
Oh, the black holes thing.
Yeah.
Because motions get passed and they just... This isn't just a regional problem, it's also a conference problem. Conference pass motions, no one knows where there must be a room somewhere. There's a conference with motions in it. It's a huge filing cabinet for motions. And Seema Chandwani she's running a campaign at the moment. She's on the Conference Arrangements Committee. She's been running a campaign to try and find out, she's been elected to this position, she's trying to ask the party, what on earth happens to all these motions, where are they? So yeah, it's something that needs... It's a legacy of the Labour Party's kind of weird bureaucratic systems, but certainly that's a good question. I don't know the answer, because no one does. Sarah asked about Momentum and IHRA and the future of Momentum. And I think Momentum should be democratised. It's not clear how you... there is the national group, I can't remember, NCG, whatever it's called. But it's not clear how you can influence Momentum kind of positions and so on, at least in the short term. And for an organisation that's espousing Labour Party democracy. I think it should be organised. I understood when the so-called momentum coup happened. I could understand the reasoning because they were worried about it taken over by a particular group. But I don't think it's not sustainable to have an organisation where it's just not going to work to have the membership being they can't influence the national office because the membership will just organise horizontally. And I think that's actually beginning to happen at the moment. So on Lisa's point about the rollout of universal credit, I completely agree. And I mean, just to go back to what I was saying about community organising, because this has been done, they've done it really cleverly. They're doing it in particular areas, obviously, and in a staggered way. So there are lots of places where it's already been rolled out, but then now it's being brought to, presumably, to this area, because you've just asked.
Yeah.
It is a focus, it can be a focus for kind of campaigning and for building alliances, because this is exactly the scenario where the community organising stuff I talked about should work, because there are lots of people who are completely desperate from the rollout of universal credit, who end up finding themselves in a situation where they haven't got enough money to afford their rent or their food, and they don't know the means of redress, and it's a weird system. And an organised Labour Party can actually, we don't want the Labour Party to be a charity, but when people who are our constituency are suffering, there's no reason why we can't go and help them. And that's something that we can actually campaign and organise on locally, and do good as well as building alliances and building trust with people who should be natural Labour supporters. So I think that, though it sounds callous, there could be an opportunity there amid the crisis, but you're absolutely right that it's going to affect a huge number of people when it does, wherever they roll it out, and there's people who don't know, and people end up in massive dire straits. And so I think that it's something that the Labour Party should absolutely be centrally involved in at a local level.